The temperature inside the stone dome was 52 degrees. Outside, it was 28 below zero, and the wind had been screaming for 6 hours without pause, and the world beyond the curved walls had become something that no longer resembled a world at all. Just white pressure, just sound, just cold moving at 60 miles an hour, looking for a way through anything that stood in his path. Helvi Makinen stood in the center of the kiln and looked at the 63 people crowded against her walls. She was 64 years old. Her hands were the color of old leather racked at every knuckle stained with the clay that had worked its way into the lines of her palms and would not come out until spring, if spring ever came. She held a burning branch in her right hand, a makeshift torch, and its light moved across the faces pressed against the stone around her. Children, women, men who had called her a liar 5 months ago. The 4-year-old girl in the corner had stopped shivering when they arrived. That was the danger sign. When the body stops shivering, it has given up trying to warm itself. Now, an hour after the doors had closed, the girl was shivering again. Color was returning to her lips. Her eyes, which had been fixed and distant, had begun to track movement. She was going to live. Helvi turned back to the fire at the center of the dome and fed it one more split log. Not two, one, measured, precise. The stones of the walls were doing their work, absorbing the heat, radiating it back, doing what her husband had spent his life understanding and what the people around her had never bothered to learn. She had been right about the river, about the winter, about all of it. She did not feel triumph. She felt only exhaustion and the particular weight of having been the only person in the room who knew what was coming for 5 months alone. 5 months ago, it had been August, and the summer air had smelled like pine sap and river water. And everything that was happening in this stone dome on the 9th of January, 1886, had been impossible to imagine for anyone who had not been paying attention. Helvi had been paying attention her entire life. She had come to the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in 1871 with her husband Pavo, and the understanding that this was not a place that made allowances for people who were not watching. Pavo Makinen had worked the charcoal kilns. He was a large, quiet man who understood fire the way some men understand horses or water. Not just the mechanics of it, but the personality of it, the way heat moved through different materials and what that movement meant. He had worked kilns in Finland before they came over, and he worked them here. And in the evenings, he would sit with Helvi and explain things in the way of a man who has spent the day thinking about something and needs to say it out loud to complete the thought. The stones hold the fire's memory, he told her once, pressing her hand flat against a kiln wall hours after the fire inside had burned to ash. Feel that, she felt it, warmth still radiating from the stone. Not the fierce heat of active fire, something slower, something more patient. The stone had absorbed the fire's energy and was releasing it back degree by degree long after the source was gone. That's why it takes 6 days to fire a kiln properly, Pavo said. You're not just heating the charcoal, you're heating the stone. And once the stone is heated, it keeps the temperature steady without more fuel. The stone does the work. She remembered his hands on the rough sandstone. She remembered the warmth. Pavo died in 1882 when a kiln collapsed during firing. The stones, which he had understood better than any other man in the settlement, fell on him before he could step back. He lived 3 hours. Not long enough to say everything that needed to be said, but long enough for her to hold his hand while he said some of it. After that, Helvi lived the way unwanted things live, by occupying the smallest possible space, by being useful enough to tolerate, but not important enough to threaten. She washed clothes for families who had too many children and not enough time. She mended shirts for pennies. She carried water from the river when the men were at the furnace. She slept in whatever corner the current household would allow, moving when tolerance expired and finding the next corner. Her wool blanket. Pavo's belt knife, which she kept hidden beneath her dress, because a woman alone without a knife is a woman who has given up a certain kind of option. The settlement near the Karp River furnace held roughly 80 souls, German families, Czech families, recruited by the railroad companies with promises of steady work at the iron furnaces. They had arrived in 1882, 1883, 1884 from places where winter was a mild inconvenience. A few months of gray skies and cold rain, and perhaps a hard frost in January that killed the garden. They did not know winter the way Helvi knew it. She had been here since 1871. She had learned the Upper Peninsula the way you learn a language you live inside rather than study, Not from books, but from repeated contact, from paying attention to what the environment told you when it was trying to tell you something important. She knew the Carp River in every season and every mood. She knew which rapids never froze, even in the worst winters, because the water moved too fast for ice to form. She knew which pools held fish in February when everything else was locked. She knew the way the tree bent in certain winds and what that bending meant about where the storm had come from and where it was going. She knew what August Brenner did not know, and what none of the families who had arrived in 1882 knew, because they had not been here long enough to know it. She knew what a deep killer winter looked like from the outside before it arrived. August Brenner was the furnace foreman and the closest thing the settlement had to a government. He was 58 years old, German, built like something that had been hit repeatedly and had absorbed every blow without changing shape. He had survived 14 Upper Peninsula winters. He had watched men die of cold and accidents in the specific stupidity that comes from underestimating a landscape that is actively hostile to human presence. He had no patience for sentiment, and he had even less patience for the particular category of person he had placed Helvey in long before she came to him with her news. Useless. An old Finnish widow who ate food that could feed useful mouths and occupied corners that could hold useful supplies and contributed nothing except the friction of her continued presence. He was not cruel by intention. He was simply a man who sorted the world into categories and acted accordingly, and Helvey had been sorted into a category from which there was no obvious exit. She understood this. She had understood it for years. It did not change what she had to tell him. She found him at the furnace in the gray light of an August morning before the heat of the day had fully established itself. The river behind her, her bucket set down, her hands still damp from the water she had scooped before she saw what was growing on the rocks beneath the surface. He was talking to two of his men when she approached. He looked at her the way he always looked at her, as if calculating whether she was worth the interruption, and concluding that she probably was not. She told him about the river. She told him the rocks were growing white from below, not frost on top of them, but ice forming on their undersides, growing upward from the riverbed itself through water that was still flowing. Anchor ice. She had seen it once before in the winter of 1874, the worst winter she had experienced in her time at the Upper Peninsula. A winter so brutal that Pavo had burned the family's only chair to keep the cabin warm enough to survive. When the river freezes from the bottom, she said, the deep cold is coming. Brenner looked at her the way he might look at a fly. Rivers freeze from the tea, he said. Water freezes at the surface first. Everyone knows this, she tried to explain. Anchor ice was different. It formed when the water was supercooled, when the temperature dropped fast enough that the rocks at the bottom of the river, which retained heat from summer, became cold enough for ice to crystallize on their surfaces and grow upward against the current. She had seen it. She was not confused about what she had seen. Brenner turned to the two men beside him. A woman who sees rivers freeze from the bottom, he said, is a woman who tells stories. He sent 3 men to the river. She followed her stomach tight. By the time they arrived, the sun had risen fully. The light falling on the water had done what morning sun always did to anchor ice, dissolved it. The rocks were dark and wet and ordinary, the same as they always were, the same as they would look to anyone who had not been there an hour earlier in the gray pre-dawn light. Nothing, one of the men said. Brenner had not bothered to come. She stood at the river's edge and looked at the rocks that had been covered in white an hour ago and were now clean and unremarkable, and she understood the problem she was facing. The evidence was real. She had seen it with her own eyes, and she knew what it meant. But the evidence appeared and disappeared with the light, and she was a 64-year-old Finnish widow whom nobody in this settlement considered worth listening to on any subject, let alone on the behavior of rivers in conditions that none of them had ever experienced. She tried again the next day, and the day after. She rose before the sky lightened, walked to the river in the dark with a lantern, and watched the anchor ice form in the pre-dawn cold. Then she walked back to the settlement and woke whoever would come and led them to the river, and arrived each time to find the ice already gone. The adults she brought were slow in the mornings. They squinted and grumbled. They moved at the pace of people who had been dragged out of warm beds for what they already suspected was a waste of their time. By the time they reached the river, the sun was doing its work on the ice, and there was nothing to see. After a week, the settlement's patience ran out entirely. A meeting was called in the largest cabin. Helvey was not invited. She stood outside in the August evening with her ear pressed to the gap between two boards and listened to people discuss what to do about her. "The Finnish woman keeps spreading panic," a voice said, talking about a killer winter. "Frightening the children, saying we should stockpile extra wood and extra food and prepare for something terrible that she cannot prove is coming. If we stockpile extra wood for a hard winter that doesn't arrive," Brenner's voice replied, "we'll have less for the next winter. Every cord of wood we cut beyond what we need is labor that could have gone to clearing more land, building better, getting ahead. I won't have us fall behind because a woman tells stories." Another voice: "She has no family. No one to answer for her. She eats our food and spreads fear," murmuring. Then Brenner again, his voice carrying the particular weight of a man who has already made his decision and is announcing it rather than proposing it. "She goes. Or your families do without." No one argued. The exile required no formal ceremony. There was no document, no official pronouncement, no sheriff summoned from the nearest town 14 miles away. It was simply the closing of doors one by one over the following days. The family whose corner she had been sleeping in found reasons why the corner was needed for other purposes. The woman who had been giving her mending work discovered she no longer had mending to give. Children who had played near her were called inside when she approached. The settlement had decided, and its decision required no legal mechanism to enforce. A community of 80 people could accomplish an exile as completely as any court, using nothing but collective agreement and the systematic withdrawal of everything that made survival possible. Helvi was out. She spent the first night in the forest, her wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the pine branches overhead filtering the starlight into something sparse and cold. The temperature was mild, perhaps 50 degrees. August in the Upper Peninsula was not cold, among. August was almost comfortable for people who did not know what was coming. She felt the cold in her bones anyway, because she understood what the anchor ice had told her, and the knowledge of what was coming sat in her chest like something heavy and immovable. She thought about her options. Walking to Marquette meant 14 miles through forest with no provisions. If she arrived, she might find work as a domestic servant, an old woman scrubbing floors for pennies. Or she might find the county poorhouse, which was a polite name for a place where unwanted people disappeared into labor they were not paid for, and rooms too small to lie down in, and the slow forgetting of everything that had made them a person before they arrived. Staying in the forest meant building something from nothing before November. A debris shelter might survive a mild winter. It would not survive a deep killer. She knew the math of that calculation. 40 degrees below zero. Blizzards that buried standing men, wind that froze exposed skin in minutes. She was 64 years old. Her hands hurt every morning. Her left knee had not worked properly since 1879, when she stepped wrong on river ice and felt something give. She was alone, and she had nothing. She thought about certain death, and she thought about probable death, and she thought about the difference between the two, and she decided that probable was better than certain, and she started walking upriver. The kiln appeared in the forest the way ruins always appear, as something that does not belong to the present moment. Too solid, too deliberate. A dome of sandstone blocks rising from the forest floor like something placed there by a civilization that no longer existed. It was 22 feet across at the base and 19 feet tall, a beehive of fitted stone that had once consumed tons of hardwood and produced the charcoal that fed the iron furnaces, that fed the railroad companies that had built this whole enterprise. The surrounding forest had been stripped of usable timber by 1883, and the kilns had been decommissioned, and 3 of the 4 had been dismantled, their stones carted away for other uses. This one remained. Paavo had worked this kiln. She knew that with the particular certainty that comes from having heard a place described so many times that you recognize it before you have consciously identified it. He had talked about this specific dome, its dimensions and its quirks, the way the draft moved through its air vents on days when the wind came from the south versus the north, the way the stone at the base heated more slowly than the stone at the crown. The loading door at ground level had partially collapsed, leaving an opening large enough for her to press through sideways. She did and stood inside. The smell was ancient smoke and cold stone, and the particular stillness of an enclosed space that had not been entered in years. Pale light fell from the chimney opening at the bottom, an oculus 20 inches across a column of gray daylight reaching the earthen floor. Cracks ran through the mortar at several places where freeze and thaw had worked their patient destruction over 3 winters of abandonment. 18 air inlet ports circled the base designed to control oxygen during charcoal production, now open to whatever the weather chose to send through them. It was not a shelter. Not yet. She walked to the nearest wall and pressed her palm flat against it. Cool, not cold, not the chill of open air, not the cold of stone exposed to an August night. Something different. Mass. The stones had a warmth to them that she could feel before she could name it, a deep residual heat that the summer sun had worked into the rock through weeks of warming, held now inside the curved walls against the cool of the morning. She remembered Paavo's hands on a kiln wall, the warmth she had felt, the patience of stone as a storage medium, absorbing heat, slowly releasing it, slowly indifferent to the urgency of the moment, because stone did not experience urgency. She stood in the center of the dome and looked up at the curve of the ceiling, and she thought about what Paavo had understood. The dome shape was not accidental. It was designed to keep heat from escaping upward. The curved ceiling reflected warmth back down toward the center of the space. The thick walls absorbed heat rather than transmitting it. The air inlet ports controlled how much cold air entered, which meant they could also control how much heat escaped. A cabin was all gaps. Every board had shrunk and shifted and left spaces for wind to move through. The better cabins in the settlement were tighter than average, but tight for a wooden structure was still full of paths for cold air to find. But a kiln sealed properly, a kiln where the mortar cracks were filled and the air ports were adjusted, a kiln where a fire was built and sustained long enough to heat the stones themselves and not just the air it saw. A kiln like that was something different. It was a vessel designed to hold heat by the people who understood heat best. If she could seal the cracks, if she could adjust the vents, if she could gather enough firewood before winter arrived, if she could survive long enough to do all of this. She sat down on the earthen floor with her back against the warm stone and looked at the column of light falling from the oculus above her, and thought about Paavo, who had understood the memory of fire and stone, who had spent 11 years trying to teach her to pay attention to what the landscape was telling her, and who had been right about most things. She thought about the 64-year-old woman she was with, the knife at her belt, and the blanket on her shoulders, and the knowledge in her head, and nothing else. She thought about the settlement 2 miles downriver, where 80 people were preparing for a winter they did not understand, using methods that would not be sufficient, building their firewood stacks to the levels that normal winters required, not knowing that the river had already told her this winter would not be normal. She had tried to tell them, they had not listened. She could still try to help them. She had no reason to. They had exiled her, closed their doors against her, decided she was less valuable than the space she occupied. She owed them nothing. The calculation was simple and clean, and left her with no obligation to do anything except survive if she could manage it in whatever way was available to her. She sat with that calculation for a long time. Then she thought about the children. The 4-year-old girl she had seen playing by the river last week. The infant in the Hoffman cabin, too young to understand any of this, too young to have made any decisions about anything at all. She stood up. She walked back out through the collapsed loading door into the August morning, and she stood in the forest looking at the kiln from the outside, and she began to plan. Not for herself. She had stopped thinking about herself when she pressed her palm against the warm stone. For the children, for the people who had not been here long enough to know what the river was saying. For whatever she could do before January arrived, and the deep killer they could not imagine came walking toward them out of the northwest. She walked to the riverbank and began collecting clay. She had no tools except Paavo's knife in her own hands, no money, no food stores, no help she could count on. She had 64 years of a life that had prepared her in ways she could not have chosen and would not have chosen for exactly this problem. She knelt in the mud at the river's edge and pulled gray clay from the bank with her bare hands and thought about Paavo explaining the mixture. 1 part clay, 1 part sand, 1 part ash bound together with dried grass. She had heard him describe the sealing compound used to repair kiln mortar so many times that she could have recited it in her sleep. She had not known when she listened to him that she was memorizing something she would need. She filled her hands and started back toward the kiln. The August morning was mild, and the birds were calling in the trees above her, and the river ran clear and fast over rocks that had been covered in white ice 2 hours ago. The winter was coming. She was the only person within 14 miles who understood what that meant. She got to work. The clay dried wrong the first time. She had mixed it too thick, pressed it into the largest crack on the kiln's north face, waited 2 days, and watched it pull away from the stone edges as it shrank. A gap appeared along the top of the patch, narrow, but present, exactly the kind of gap that cold air would find in January without difficulty. She peeled the failed patch out with Pavo's knife and started again. 1 part clay, 1 part sand, 1 part ash, bound with dried grass to hold the mixture together as it cured. She had heard the proportions from Pavo so many times that she could recite them in the dark. But hearing a formula and executing it with your hands in the specific conditions of an Upper Peninsula August with no tools except a knife and a bucket, she had found rusting in the brush near the kiln entrance, were different kinds of knowledge. She learned by failing. She mixed batches that cracked and batches that crumbled, and eventually she mixed a batch that held, that bonded to the sandstone and dried with enough flexibility to survive the contraction of cooling without pulling free. When she pressed her fingernail into the cured surface and felt it resist, she sat back on her heels and looked at the patch and felt something she had not felt since the exile. Progress. It was a small thing, a repaired crack on a ruined kiln 6 inches long, barely visible in the wall of a structure that had more wrong with it than right. But it held. And things that held were the only foundation she had available. She kept working. The days organized themselves around the work. She woke before the sky lightened, when the air still held the night cold and the forest was entirely dark and still. She rose from where she slept against the interior wall of the kiln, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, and she began immediately, because there was no value in waiting, and because the body, she had learned, accepted cold better when it was moving. She gathered clay from the riverbank in the pre-dawn dark. She mixed her batches by feel, learning the texture that meant the proportions were correct. She worked from the ground up on each wall section, pressing the mixture into cracks with her fingers, smoothing it flat, with the heel of her palm moving to the next section when she had gone as far as she could reach without climbing. She built makeshift scaffolding from stones stacked inside the kiln platforms she could stand on to reach the upper sections of the walls. The stones shifted when she climbed them. She fell twice in August, once badly enough to lie still on the earthen floor for several minutes, assessing the damage. Nothing broken, everything hurt. She kept working. The air inlet ports presented a different problem. There were 18 of them, each roughly 6 inches square, circling the kiln's base at ground level. During charcoal production, they had been opened and closed in specific combinations to control the oxygen, reaching the fire, managing the combustion, so the wood converted to charcoal rather than burning to ash. Now they were simply 18 holes that let the outdoor air in and the indoor air out. She could not seal them completely. A fire required oxygen, and she intended to build fires inside the kiln, and a fire without oxygen was no fire at all. But she could block most of them and leave only the ones that faced away from the prevailing winter wind, which came from the northwest, which meant she needed to keep the ports on the southeast side open and block everything else. She filled them with clay and stone, pressing the mixture in from both sides, leaving 3 ports open on the sheltered side of the structure. Then she watched how the air moved inside the kiln when the wind blew, holding a piece of dry grass near the open ports, and watching which way it bent, mapping the draft that would eventually carry smoke upward through the oculus at the top. The chimney opening at the top was 20 inches across, which was efficient for industrial charcoal production and badly oversized for the kind of slow winter fire she was planning. She built a collar of clay around the interior rim of the oculus, reducing the opening gradually over several applications as each layer dried until she had brought it down to roughly 8 inches. Large enough for smoke to exit, small enough to stop cold air from pouring in when the wind pushed down from above. She tested the draw on a September morning by building a small fire of dry leaves in the center of the floor and watching the smoke rise. It rose cleanly straight up, pulled toward the reduced opening by the draft from the inlet ports below. The kiln breathed correctly. She stood in the center of the dome and watched the smoke rise and felt Pavo's knowledge working in her hands. She was hauling deadfall wood from the forest in late August when Conrad Brenner found her. She had been collecting fallen branches, the only timber she could gather without an axe, dragging them through the underbrush to a pile she was building at the side of the kiln. Oak deadfall was the best, dense and slow-burning, worth the effort of dragging, even when the pieces were awkward and heavy. She had a section of fallen oak across her shoulders bent forward, under its weight, when she heard a footstep behind her that was deliberately placed to announce itself. She stopped. She did not turn around immediately. She took one breath and set the branch down, and then she turned. Conrad Brenner was 30 years old, his uncle's nephew, in the way that certain people are built entirely from the traits of a family line. The same jaw, the same certainty, the same assumption that the world organized itself around his convenience. He was standing with his arms crossed and his weight back, the posture of someone who has decided they hold all the cards and wants you to know it before they begin. He told her the land belonged to the Jackson Iron Company. He told her the trees belonged to the Jackson Iron Company. He told her the kiln she was squatting in was company property, which meant every branch she dragged to it was theft, and every night she spent inside it was trespass. He said he could tell the sheriff in Marquette. He described the county poorhouse with the particular detail of someone who had never been there, but had thought carefully about how to make it sound as bad as possible. 16 hours of work a day, no pay, rooms too small to lie down in. And if you cause trouble, something worse than that. He stepped closer. Helvy's hand moved toward Paavo's knife. Not to draw it, just to confirm it was there. He told her to leave. Walk south, walk east. Walk in whatever direction she chose, but stop surviving in this particular location, because every day she remained was a day that made his uncle look wrong. And his uncle did not like looking wrong, and Conrad did not like things that made his uncle look wrong. He released whatever he had been gripping, stepped back and smiled the smile of a man who believes he has settled something. Then he walked away. Helvy stood alone in the forest for a moment. She looked at the oak branch she had set down. She picked it up and kept walking toward the kiln. She understood what Conrad had told her without meaning to. He was not afraid of her dying. He was afraid of her surviving. Every morning that she woke up in that stone dome and went about her work was a morning that demonstrated silently and without argument that August Brenner had made an error when he exiled her, that the old Finnish woman had known something worth knowing, that casting her out had been not wisdom but mistake. Conrad wanted her gone, not because she was a threat, but because she was evidence. She filed that understanding away and continued working. From that point forward, she moved her schedule further into the darkness. She was at the riverbank collecting clay before there was enough light to see her clearly from a distance. She was back at the kiln before the settlement fully woke. She gathered wood in the brief windows, between activities, moving through the forest on paths she had identified that kept the kiln between herself and the settlement's sightlines. She was not hiding exactly. She was simply reducing the opportunities for interruption. In early September, Greta Vogt appeared at the top of the riverbank. Helvy was below knee-deep in the cold water, pulling gray clay from the bank with both hands and packing it into her bucket. She heard footsteps above and looked up. Greta was 40 years old, German, a widow since 1884, when her husband died of pneumonia. 3 children under 12. She had survived by working harder than anyone around her would acknowledge, and asking for less than she was owed, and accepting the terms the settlements set because she did not have the option of rejecting them. She had been one of the few people in the settlement who had ever treated Helvy as a person rather than an inconvenience. An extra portion of stew passed across the table without comment. A blanket loaned on a cold night with no discussion of when it should be returned. Small things. The kind of small things that meant everything to someone who had been sorted into the category of tolerated nuisance. Greta looked at Helvy below her on the bank. "I heard you're working on the old kiln," she said. "I am," Helvy said. She did not stop filling the bucket. Greta looked around the way people look around when they want to know if anyone is watching them. Satisfied, she climbed down the bank, her skirts trailing in the mud, and stood close enough that Helvy could smell wood smoke and lye soap. She said she was not there to mock. She was there because she was worried. Helvy was alone out there. If she was hurt, she would die on before anyone found her. Helvy looked at her steadily. "If I stay here," she said, "I die surrounded by people who have decided I am not worth keeping. Is that better?" Greta's face moved through something complicated. "Then help me," Helvy said. Greta looked away. She said she had 3 children. She said if she was seen helping the woman August Brenner had exiled, Brenner would make her life impossible. No trading partners, no shared resources in hard times. No community of any kind at the moment when community was the difference between surviving and not surviving. She said she could not risk her children for a woman who told stories. Helvey went back to filling the bucket. Greta stood there. Then she climbed back up the bank. At the top, she paused without turning around. "The clay you're gathering," she said. "You'll need sand and ash mixed in, or it'll crack when it dries. 1 part clay, 1 part sand, 1 part ash. Dried grass to hold it together." She walked away without waiting for a response. Helvey looked at the bucket in her hands. She had been using the wrong mixture. Too much clay, not enough binding agents. That was why her early patches had cracked and had pulled free. She thought about what it cost Greta to say that. The calculation of distance and deniability, placing herself far enough away and turning away quickly enough that the information could not quite be attributed to her. The fiction of having heard nothing and said nothing, thin enough to be useful. Helvey adjusted her proportions and went back to work. October was the month the work became real. The ceiling was largely done by the end of September. All the major cracks filled most of the air vents, blocked the chimney collar built and tested. The interior of the kiln was transformed in a way she could feel walking through the loading door. Less drafty, more still. The sense of an enclosed space rather than a ruin, the walls actually beginning to do the thing walls were designed to do. But warmth required fuel, and fuel required cutting, and cutting required an axe she did not have. Without an axe, she was limited to deadfall fallen branches and windblown limbs. Nothing large enough to burn hot or long. She had estimated she needed 5 to 6 cords of firewood to heat the kiln through a hard winter. By the end of September, she had perhaps 1.5 cords, mostly small diameter wood, that would burn fast and require constant tending. She thought about this at night, lying against the interior wall with her blanket around her, listening to the first cold winds of autumn moving through the forest outside. She thought about it without self-pity. Self-pity consumed energy she did not have to spare. She simply looked at the problem the way Pavo would have looked at a kiln that was not drawing correctly. What was wrong? Why it was wrong? What could be done about it? Then Greta came back. She appeared at the kiln entrance on a gray October morning, earlier than Helvey expected any visitor, carrying a cloth sack over one shoulder and moving quickly, looking behind her as she walked. She said she had been cleaning and had found her late husband's things. She held out the sack. Inside was a small axe, its head darkened with rust, but the steel underneath still sound. A mine of rendered fat for waterproofing leather and treating wood. A wool cap that had probably fit a grown man and would sit low over Helvey's ears like a pot. "I need clay," Greta said, "for sealing my cabin windows before winter. We could trade." Helvey looked at her. She understood what was happening. Greta's windows did not need clay. This was charity wrapped in the fiction of commerce, a gift dressed as an exchange so that neither of them had to acknowledge what it actually was, so that Greta could maintain the deniability she needed, and Helvey could accept help without the specific humiliation of accepting charity. "I have clay," Helvey said. "More than I need." "Then we'll trade," Greta said. Helvey gave her a bucket of prepared mixture that Greta would almost certainly never use. Greta gave her the sack with the axe and the fat and the hat. They said nothing more. Greta walked back toward the settlement, looking around her as she went. Helvey held the axe in both hands and felt the weight of it. She went to the nearest standing dead tree, a birch that had died 2 winters ago, and dried where it stood, and she swung. The axe bit cleanly. November 12th dawned clear and cold. The temperature had dropped sharply overnight. 12 degrees, perhaps, 15 cold for early November, but not unheard of the Upper Peninsula pushing toward its winter conditions earlier than some years and later than others. Helvey rose before the sky lightened and walked to the river. She did not go because she expected anything. She went because she had been going every few days since August, out of habit and out of the persistent sense that the river was the most reliable information source. She had access to, more honest than the people in the settlement and more consistent than her own fears. She walked to the rapids where she had first seen it in August. They were back. Ice growing upward from the riverbed, encasing rocks in white, pushing through flowing water that should have been too warm and too fast to freeze. The same phenomenon. Clearer now, more established, covering more of the riverbed than it had in August. The anchor ice thicker and more confident, as if the winter behind it had strengthened in the months since the first warning. She crouched at the water's edge and looked at it for a long time. She did not stand up and run toward the settlement. She did not wake anyone. She did not try again to explain what she had seen and what it meant. She was done explaining. She had explained in August, and the evidence had dissolved in the sunlight before anyone with the power to act on it could see it. She had explained a second time and a third time and had been called a liar and had been exiled and had been threatened by a 30-year-old man who was afraid of her continued survival. Explanations had accomplished nothing. She watched the anchor ice for another few minutes. Then she stood, her knees aching in the November cold, and she walked back to the kiln. She picked up the axe. If the evidence would not be believed, then the only thing left to do was to be ready for the thing the evidence predicted. Ready for 63 people or however many the settlement held, because they were not going to be ready for themselves and someone had to be. She swung the axe. The wood split. She stacked the pieces. December was a blur of labor. She fell into a rhythm that had no room for anything except the work. Wake before light. Swing the axe until her arms stopped responding properly. Rest an hour. Swing again. Every hour of daylight she could keep the axe moving was an hour's worth of warmth stored against the coming cold. She learned which standing dead trees were worth the effort, the birch and beech that had died dry and would burn clean, and which were too punky and rotten to heat anything. The axe was dull by the end of November. She found a flat stone in the riverbed and spent 2 evenings sharpening the edge by feel in the low firelight, working the stone along the blade angle until the edge bit into her thumbnail without slipping. It was not a blacksmith's edge. It was a surviving edge, sufficient for the work that remained. She ate what the forest gave her, dried mushrooms she had gathered in October and stored in a cloth bag hung from the kiln's interior wall. Rose hips. The occasional fish from the river pools she knew would still be accessible beneath the ice forming at the banks. She was losing weight she did not have to lose. She knew it. She could feel it in the looseness of her clothing, in the way her collarbone had become more prominent in the effort it now took to accomplish things that had been routine in September. She kept going. By the 20th of December, she had added 3 more cords to her pile, 5.5 cords total stacked inside the kiln and beneath a lean-to of pine branches she had built against the exterior wall. Not everything she had hoped for. Enough. Possibly enough if the winter ran as long as the one in 1874, and if she managed the fuel carefully, and if the kiln's thermal mass performed the way she believed it would. She tested it on a night when the temperature dropped to 20 below. She built a fire at sunset and fed it steadily for 6 hours, the kind of hot, sustained fire that would heat the stones, not just the air. She fed it until the walls were warm to the touch in the places where the ceiling was thinnest, until she could feel the heat radiating from the sandstone under her palm. Then she let the fire die. She wrapped herself in her blanket and lay against the interior wall and slept. She woke at dawn. She did not immediately check the thermometer she had constructed from river water in a sealed container, watching where the ice first formed to calibrate her temperature readings. She lay still for a moment, first simply feeling the air around her. Warm. Not warm like a heated room. Not warm like standing next to a fire. But warm in a way that had nothing to do with the fire, which had been cold ash for 8 hours. Warm in a way that came from the walls themselves, the stone releasing what it had absorbed the night before, doing it slowly and steadily through the long, dark hours. She checked her temperature gauge. 8 hours without fire. Temperature outside still well below zero. Inside the sealed kiln, 31 degrees. Cold enough to see her breath. Cold enough to need every layer she owned. But 31 degrees was not dying cold. 31 degrees was surviving cold, especially with 63 people generating body heat inside an enclosed stone dome. The stones were doing what Pavo had promised they would do. She sat in the cold interior of the kiln on a December morning and pressed her palm flat against the warm wall and felt it as clearly as she had felt anything in her life. Warmth stored, warmth held, warmth released slowly and patiently into the dark. She thought about her husband, who had worked this kiln and understood these stones and taught her to pay attention to things that most people did not bother to look at. She was as ready as she was going to be. The first week of January brought a warmth that had no business existing. The temperature climbed from 15 below to 5 above to 28 degrees over the span of 3 days. The snow softened. The wind calmed to almost nothing. Settlers emerged from their cabins, blinking at the pale winter sunlight, grateful for the reprieve, letting themselves believe for a few days that the worst was behind them. Conrad Brenner came to the kiln on the third day of the mild spell. He stood at the entrance, not coming inside, looking at what she had built, with an expression caught somewhere between contempt and something he would not have admitted to. "Still alive, little liar," he said. She sat by her small fire and did not look up from the split log she was feeding into it. He told her the mild weather confirmed what his uncle had always said. The real cold always came in late January, if it came at all. When it did, he said her stone cave would be her coffin. She would burn through her wood in a week and freeze to death, waiting for a spring that would not care whether she had been right about the river or not. "Get out," she said. He laughed. He said he would check back in a month to see if the wolves had found her yet. He walked away. Helvey watched him go. She was not thinking about Conrad. She was thinking about the warmth and what the warmth meant, and about a thing Pavo had said one January evening, when she had made the mistake of feeling encouraged by a mild spell. He had looked out the window at the softening snow, and he had said it quietly, almost to himself, the way he said things he had been carrying for a while. When January smiles, he said, what comes after does not. She turned from the entrance and looked at the fire and looked at the stack of wood she had built and looked at the walls she had sealed through 5 months of work that no one had watched and no one had helped with and no one had believed in. She got up and brought the last of the outdoor wood inside. She checked every seal one more time, every clay patch, every blocked vent, every collar around the chimney opening. She pressed her palms against the interior walls in a dozen places, feeling for cold spots for places where the ceiling had failed. Everything held. She built the fire up hotter than usual and let the stones absorb what they could absorb. Then she sat down beside the fire in the sealed kiln and waited. The mild weather had 3 more days to run. The settlement would employ all 3 of them, taking the warmth as a gift, relaxing the wood-burning discipline they had barely established, opening doors and venting heat they would not be able to replace. She knew what was coming after the mild weather ended. She had known since August, when she crouched by the river in the gray pre-dawn light and watched ice grow upward from the bottom of a fast-moving current. She had tried to tell them. They had not listened. She could not make them listen. She could not carry their firewood for them or seal their cabins or teach them in 5 days what she had spent 5 months learning. She could not undo August and the exile and the closed doors and the children pulled inside when she approached. What she could do was be ready. The kiln was ready. She was ready. Outside, the mild January air moved through the forest with the false gentleness of something that did not mean to be gentle for long. She fed the fire one more log and settled into wait for what she had known was coming since the morning the river told her the truth. The storm announced itself before it arrived. Helvey felt it in the pressure, a change in the quality of the air that she could not have named precisely, but recognized the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in years. Something settling, something withdrawing. The mild days had left the world in a posture of relaxation. Doors open, wood stacks depleted by the false warmth, people moving through the settlement with the particular looseness of bodies that have released the tension of sustained cold. Then the pressure changed. She was sitting by her fire on the morning of January 9th when she felt it. She did not need to go outside to know. She fed the fire 2 more logs than she had planned to use that morning, watching the stones absorb the additional heat, and she sat with her hands flat on the earthen floor and waited. By noon, the wind had shifted. From the northwest, which was the direction that mattered in the Upper Peninsula, the direction from which everything serious had always come in the 14 years she had been paying attention to this landscape. By 3 in the afternoon, the first gusts hit. She was at the kiln entrance watching the tree line when the darkness came rolling across the tops of the pines from the northwest. Not clouds exactly. Something denser than clouds, a wall of weather moving with a purpose and a speed that had no parallel in anything the mild days had suggested was possible. The temperature, which had sat at 28 degrees all morning, dropped 10 degrees in the time it took her to watch the darkness reach the nearest trees. She went inside. She sealed the entrance. She fed the fire. By 6 in the evening, the temperature outside had fallen to 8 degrees above zero. By 8, it was 12 below. By 10, it was 22 below and still dropping. She could hear the wind. Not the way you hear wind in a wooden building where the sound comes through the walls and the gap and the rattling of whatever is not nailed down tightly enough. She heard it the way you hear something far away and powerful, a sound that had to travel through 2 feet of stone and sealed mortar to reach her arriving, diminished a murmur of something vast happening at a distance. The kiln walls did not move. She had expected to feel some vibration, some shuddering of the structure under the sustained pressure of 60-mile-an-hour wind. There was nothing. The dome absorbed what the wind threw at it and returned nothing, the mass of the stone too great for weather to register against. She checked the interior temperature with her calibration gauge. 38 degrees. The fire had been burning for 6 hours, a careful, sustained burn, the kind that heated the stones rather than just the air. She was not trying to maintain comfort. She was trying to heat the walls themselves, charging them against what was coming. She added 2 more logs and sat back and listened to the murmur of the storm through stone. 2 miles away, the settlement was losing. She would not know the details until later, until people told her in the days after the storm what had happened inside the structures she had never seen from the inside. What she knew sitting in the kiln was arithmetic and physics, and the arithmetic and physics were not complicated. A wooden cabin leaked heat in direct proportion to the wind speed outside it. Every gap in the chinking, every place where boards had shrunk against each other over 3 winters of freeze and thaw, every crack around a window frame or door frame or floorboard became a path for the outside air to enter and the inside air to exit. When the wind was calm, the leakage was modest, manageable, something a well-built fire could compensate for, without excessive fuel consumption. When the wind was 60 miles an hour and the temperature was 22 below zero, and still falling, the leakage became catastrophic. August Brenner had watched his furnace settlement consolidate over the previous weeks of cold, the smaller families moving into the larger cabins to share heat and share fuel, the rational behavior of people who understood that body heat was a resource and isolation was a liability. The largest cabin, the Hoffman cabin, held 14 people by the night of January 9th. 3 families pressed together around a fire that was consuming wood at 3 times its normal rate just to maintain a temperature that was killing them anyway. 32 degrees inside the Hoffman cabin, then 28, then 20. A woman pressed children to her chest. A man fed the fire with wood he had not planned to burn until February. The infant in the corner made a sound that the infant's mother had heard before in other contexts and did not want to hear again. In the second cabin, the one with the tar paper roof that had always been the weakest structure in the settlement, things were worse. A gust at midnight found the edge of the roof where the tar paper had never been properly secured and lifted it. Not all of it, a section 3 feet wide and 5 feet long enough. Snow began to enter. The family in that corner moved away from it, and the snow accumulated in the space they abandoned, and the temperature in the cabin dropped past the point where the fire could argue with it. August Brenner stood in the Hoffman cabin at 2 in the morning and looked at 14 people who were going to die if nothing changed. And he did the calculation that his 58 years of being a man who solved problems had prepared him to do. He knew what the calculation produced before he finished it. He knew who was in the kiln. He had worked kilns for years back when the charcoal industry was still the dominant technology in this part of the Upper Peninsula. He knew their construction. 2-foot walls of fitted sandstone, dome ceilings that reflected heat back to the center, masts that absorbed fire and released it slowly hour after hour, long after the flames died. He had heard of men surviving in kilns during emergencies, prospectors caught in storms, workers sheltering when weather closed roads. He had also made the connection he had been refusing to make for 5 months. The old Finnish woman had said anchor ice. He had sent men to look, and they had found nothing. He had called her a liar and cast her out, and she had gone to the abandoned kiln and spent 5 months doing something there, while the settlement watched with the particular satisfaction of people who have confirmed their judgment of someone they did not want to be wrong about. And now it was 2 in the morning, and it was 22 below zero outside, and the Hoffman cabin was at 18 degrees with the fire roaring, and a 4-year-old girl had stopped shivering, which meant her body had stopped fighting, which meant she was dying, and Brenner was the man who had to decide what happened next. He spoke to the room. "Get dressed," he said. "Everything you own, wear it. Children get wrapped in blankets and carried. We are going to the kiln." A woman's voice, thin with cold and exhaustion, the Finnish woman's kiln. 2 miles in this, that kiln stood through 14 years of charcoal firing without cracking. Brenner said, "It is still standing. Our cabins will not be standing by morning." He said it quietly, and he said it with the authority of a man who had made his decision and was not going to revisit it. No one argued. They tied a rope between themselves before they went outside. 30 feet of hemp knotted at intervals of 3 feet so that each person had something to grip and something that connected them to the people on either side. Brenner took the front. He had walked the path between the settlement and the kiln hundreds of times in daylight. He had walked it in dark and in snow. He had never walked it in a blizzard at 25 below zero, with 63 people depending on him to find a stone dome in the dark. The wind hit them the moment they cleared the cabin door. Not wind in the way the word usually described the thing, a physical presence, a wall of moving air carrying ice crystals so fine they penetrated every gap in clothing, finding skin through layers that should have been enough stinging, exposed faces with a sensation that was initially pain and quickly became numbness. Visibility was perhaps 4 feet. Brenner oriented himself by the sound of the river, which he could not see but could hear beneath the wind, the particular sound of fast water under forming ice, a rushing, muffled sound that told him which way the bank ran. He kept it on his left and moved. Behind him the rope went taut, and then came with him 62 people following its pull through darkness they could not see into. A woman fell in the second hour. He felt the rope jerk differently and stopped and waited for the signal to come back to him that she was up, and it came, and he kept moving. A man's hat went, and Brenner heard him shout briefly and then say nothing more about it. Children cried for the first part of the walk and then stopped, not from comfort, but from the cold claiming their voices, and the silence that replaced the crying was worse than the crying had been. He counted constantly. 63. He would not leave anyone. He could not leave anyone. He stopped 3 times to count the people he could feel on the rope and tried to extrapolate the number he could not directly verify. The walk should have taken 40 minutes. It took nearly 3 hours. The kiln appeared as a shape that did not move. Everything else was moving. The snow was horizontal, the trees were in motion, the air itself seemed to be in motion in ways that air should not be. But there was a shape ahead that was simply there, solid and dark and still, a dome of stone that had been placed on this piece of ground more than 20 years ago and had absorbed everything the Upper Peninsula had thrown at it since without moving an inch. Brenner released the rope and stepped forward alone and found the entrance. He knocked. He knocked on a piece of pine planking stretched across a hide-covered frame, a door that should not have been able to keep anything out, but had been built by someone who understood that the point was not the door itself, but what the door was set into a sealed stone threshold that changed the equation of what the door had to accomplish. A moment of nothing. Then the sound of something being moved from the inside. Then light. Not much light. The fire inside was small, carefully managed, a fraction of what it could have been. But after 3 hours in the dark and the horizontal snow, even that small flame was a different category of experience. The light spilled out through the opening and touched the faces of the people crowded behind Brenner, and he saw what 63 people looked like after 3 hours in 25 below zero wind. Helvi Makinen stood in the opening. She was 64 years old and hollow-cheeked and holding a burning branch in her right hand, and she looked at August Brenner. She looked at him for one moment. He did not speak. He had words prepared, or thought he had, but in the moment of facing her in the entrance of the kiln she had built from a ruin while the settlement watched and called her a liar, the words did not come. She looked past him at the line of people stretching back into the dark. Children limp in their parents' arms, lips, pale eyes closed. Adults bent against the wind, their clothing coated in ice, their faces showing the blank, focused expression of people who have been surviving rather than living for the last 3 hours. She stepped to one side. "Get in," she said. "Close the door behind the last person. Do not let the fire smoke too much at once. The stones need time to work with the heat. Move slowly once you are inside and give the air time to settle." They came through the entrance in ones and twos, each person releasing something when they crossed the threshold, some tension that had been held since they stepped out of the Hoffman cabin. The relief of stone walls that did not shake. The cessation of wind noise. The quality of air that was not trying to kill them. 63 people in a dome, 22 feet across. There was no comfortable way to arrange that many bodies in that space. They pressed against the walls and against each other, sitting on the earthen floor, with knees drawn up, standing in the center. Children placed in the warmest spots closest to the fire, adults taking the outer positions where the temperature was lower. The interior temperature when they arrived was 36 degrees. She began feeding the fire, not recklessly, not with the desperation of someone trying to make the cold stop as fast as possible, with the measured precision of someone who understood that what she was heating was not the air, but the stone, and that stone required time and sustained input rather than sudden bursts. She added wood in increments, watching the fire's color, watching the walls in the places where she had tested the thermal response during her months of preparation. She watched the stones rather than the thermometer, because the stones told her more. Within an hour, the temperature had risen to 44 degrees. Within 2 hours, 52. Body heat from 63 people filled the space with a warmth that compounded the fire's output and the wall's radiation into something that was, by any reasonable standard, comfortable. Not warm in the way of a July afternoon, warm in the way of a space that was choosing to protect the people inside it, choosing in the way that physics chooses through the patient application of mass and insulation and the slow release of stored energy. The 4-year-old girl who had stopped shivering began shivering again. Her mother noticed first. Helvi heard the small sound the woman made, not words, just a sound, and she understood what it meant. The body shivering was the body fighting. The body that shivered had not given up. The girl was going to live. The storm ran for 4 days. For 4 days, 63 people lived in a dome designed for industrial production, sustained by a fire that burned less wood than a single cabin would have required, heated by their own bodies and by stones that had been learning to hold warmth since before any of them were born. Helvi rationed the firewood in quarter-quart increments per day. She showed the adults closest to the fire how to add wood correctly, the angle and placement that maintained steady combustion without wasteful flaring, the timing that kept the stones charging rather than just the air warming. They learned quickly because learning quickly was the alternative to freezing, and people are excellent students when the examination is immediate. The interior temperature never dropped below 45 degrees. Outside, the temperature never rose above 20 below. She managed the air vents, adjusting them as the body heat of 63 people changed the internal dynamics of the space, opening slightly when the air grew thick and closing again before cold could establish a foothold. She monitored the chimney draw, watching the smoke rise and making small adjustments to the clay collar when the draft changed with the wind direction. She slept in 90-minute intervals, waking to check the fire and the fuel in the vents, and the people cycling through the dome in the dark hours, checking the children first. On the morning of the second day, one of the men she recognized from the furnace crew asked if he could help maintain the fire through the night so she could sleep. She showed him what she had shown the others, the timing and the placement and the quantity. She watched him do it twice. Then she slept for 4 hours, which was the longest sleep she had managed since August. On the third night, August, Brenner found her sitting near the entrance. She had moved there partly for air and partly for quiet, the accumulated breathing and moving of 63 people in a confined space having become, after 3 days, something she needed occasional distance from. She sat with her back against the wall near the sealed loading door, her blanket around her shoulders, watching the small fire at the center of the dome. He sat down beside her. He was a large man, and the space near the entrance was not generous, and his sitting down beside her was a deliberate act that she noted without acknowledging. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The sounds of the kiln at night surrounded them, the slow breathing of sleeping people, the occasional shift of a child, the crackle of the fire, and beneath all of it, distant and diminished but present, the sound of the storm continuing outside the walls. He said, "The river freezes from the bottom." She did not respond. He said, "I did not know that was possible. I had been told, and I had understood, and I believed I knew that ice forms at the surface first. That is what I knew." He paused. "I did not know about anchor ice. I did not know the conditions that produced it or what it predicted. I had been here for 14 winters, and I did not know that." She looked at the fire. "You tried to tell us in August," he said. "You tried 3 times, and each time you came to me, I sent men to look, and they found nothing. And I told the settlement, you told stories." She said nothing. "I cast you out," he said. "I told them your food was not worth the mouth it fed, that your corner was worth more empty. I made your survival impossible, and I did it in front of everyone so that the decision would hold." He stopped. His voice was not performing remorse. It was simply describing what had happened, the flat narration of a man who has decided to look at something directly rather than at an angle. If you had died out here, he said, I would have been the cause of it. There is no other word for that. He did not ask for forgiveness. He did not say he was sorry, which would have been a request for something, a plea for her to provide him with relief from what he was carrying. He simply said what was true and let the truth exist in the space between them without asking her to do anything about it. Helvey looked at the fire for a long time. She thought about what she could say. She had 5 months of material to work with. 5 months of working alone before dawn to avoid his nephew. 5 months of falling off improvised scaffolding and lying on the earthen floor counting the things that were not broken. 5 months of cold nights and inadequate food and the particular loneliness of doing something that no one believed in, and that would have meant nothing if the winter had been mild, if she had been wrong, if the anchor ice in August had been a freak occurrence rather than a prophecy. She thought about what it would feel like to say all of that. Then she thought about the 4-year-old girl who had started shivering again, and the infant whose cry had grown stronger through the second day, and the 57 other people who were going to walk out of this kiln when the storm ended. She said, I did not save you because you deserved saving. He looked at her. I saved the children, she said. They deserved saving. They had nothing to do with August or exiles or what anyone decided about the river. She looked at him steadily. And I saved you, she said, because letting you die in the cold would have made me the same as you. And I have spent 64 years being something different from that. I was not going to stop on the 9th of January. She stood up. She pulled her blanket tighter and walked back toward the fire, stepping carefully around sleeping bodies. And she did not look back at August Brenner sitting alone near the entrance with the truth she had handed him to hold by himself. The storm broke on this morning of January 13th. She knew it was breaking before she could see it, felt the change in the air pressure again, the same subtle shift she had felt 4 days earlier, but running in the opposite direction. The wind, which had been a constant presence for 96 hours, began to gap. Silences appeared between gusts, brief at first and then longer until the silences were longer than the gusts, and the world outside the stone walls was doing something it had not done since the 8th of January. It was going quiet. She unsealed the entrance and stepped outside into the first clear morning since the storm began. The landscape was unrecognizable. Drifts 7 and 8 feet high against the north face of the kiln, sculpted by 4 days of wind into shapes that had no organic reference. Clean curves and sharp ridges that caught the early light and threw it back. The forest was partially buried, the smaller trees invisible beneath accumulated snow, the larger ones stripped of branches on the windward side. The cold was absolute. 38 degrees below zero, which was the coldest reading she had taken at any point in the storm. But it was a cold without wind, and still cold at 38 below was survivable in ways that cold with wind was not. She stood outside the kiln in the first light and breathed the still air and looked at what the storm had done to the world. Then she went back inside and began waking people. They emerged into the cold morning in groups, blinking at the light, moving carefully on legs that had been folded in the same positions for too long. Brenner organized the men into a party and led them toward the settlement to assess the damage before anyone attempted to return. Helvey watched them go across the snow in the pale morning light, following the buried depression in the landscape where the riverbank ran. She went back into the kiln and began checking on the people who remained. 2 women with young children who were not yet ready to walk in the cold. An elderly man whose feet had suffered during the walk from the settlement and needed careful warming before he could put weight on them. She worked through the group with the same methodical attention she had given to the kiln's preparation, one person at a time, looking for the specific signs of damage that cold inflicted on bodies. Greta Vogt found her in the late morning, standing outside the kiln in a brief window of relative warmth as the sun climbed. They stood beside each other without speaking for a moment. Greta said the axe. Helvey said yes. Greta said, I thought I was giving you something to help you survive a little longer. I did not think it would matter for anyone else. She paused. I did not believe you could actually do this. Helvey looked at the kiln, at the sealed walls, at the chimney collar she had built from clay, mixed in the proportions a dead man had taught her. Neither did I, she said. She did not say it from false modesty. She said it because it was true. In August, she had known what the river was saying, and she had believed the knowledge itself was real, and she had committed to acting on it, but the gap between knowing something and executing it in conditions of exile and cold and physical limitation and complete isolation was a gap she had not been certain she could cross. She had crossed it. Greta reached out and took her hand. The hand she took was not the hand of a woman who had spent the summer in reasonable condition. It was the hand of someone who had spent 5 months in conditions that changed hands permanently, calloused past anything soft remaining, clay stained into the creases, the knuckles enlarged by the repeated impact of work that hands were not designed to sustain indefinitely. Greta held it anyway. "You saved us," she said. Helvy looked at the hand holding hers. "I saved myself," she said. "You happened to be there." But she did not pull her hand away. The accounting came later. Brenner's party returned from the settlement in the afternoon with news that required time to absorb. The Hoffman cabin had survived structurally. The second cabin, the one with the tar paper roof, had not. Its roof had failed completely under the accumulated snow load, and the walls had followed. It was rubble. In the settlement as a whole, 4 people had died. An elderly woman who had refused to make the walk to the kiln, who had stayed in the smaller structure with 5 others and fallen asleep in the cold and not woken up. An infant whose mother had tried everything she knew and had not known enough. 2 men from another group who had attempted to reach neighbors during the storm and had been found a quarter-mile from where they started within sight of shelter they could not reach. 4 deaths, none in the kiln. 63 people had come through the entrance in the dark and cold, and they had all come out again in the pale morning light. That was the arithmetic of the things stripped of everything else. The kiln had held. Conrad Brenner worked in the days following the storm with the others, digging out the settlement, salvaging what could be salvaged, beginning the repairs that would take weeks to complete. He took direction on fire management from Helvy, without comment, learning the fuel rationing and vent adjustment she had developed through 5 months of trial, obeying the instructions precisely. He did not speak to her beyond what the work required. That was its own kind of answer to a question neither of them had asked aloud. Spring came the way spring always comes to the Upper Peninsula, slowly and without apology for how long it had taken. By March, the worst was over. By April, people were moving freely between the settlement and the kiln site, coming to look at what had saved them, to press their hands against the walls the way she had pressed her hands against them in August, when she was trying to understand what she had to work with. She showed anyone who asked how she had done it. The clay mixture, the proportions, the technique of pressing it into cracks in multiple thin layers rather than one thick one. The vent configuration, which ports to leave open, and which direction they should face relative to the prevailing wind. The chimney collar and how to size it for the fire you plan to burn. The principle of heating the stone rather than the air, which required patience and a longer initial burn, but produced warmth that lasted. She did not charge for any of it. Paavo had spent his life learning what she was teaching, and he had taught her freely, and the knowledge belonged to anyone who needed it. By spring 11, households in the surrounding area had begun some version of what she had built, adding interior stone walls to wooden cabins to create thermal mass sealing every crack, with the clay mixture building proper masonry hearths instead of the simple fireboxes that sent most of their heat up the chimney. The innovation moved through the region the way useful knowledge moves person to person, not through any formal channel, but through the simple demonstration of having worked when nothing else did. People came to see the kiln before they attempted their own improvements. She showed them through it, explaining each element, answering questions that showed they were genuinely trying to understand rather than simply copy. She had spent 64 years being considered unnecessary. She had spent 5 months being considered a liar. She spent the spring being listened to, which was a different experience, and she accepted it with the equanimity of someone who had long since stopped requiring it. Helvy Makinen lived in the settlement near the Karp River furnace until 1891, when she married a Finnish sawyer named Eino Järvinen and moved with him to Ishpeming, 15 miles south. She was 70 years old. Neighbors who knew her in those later years would remember that her house was always the warmest on the street in winter, its walls lined with stone, every crack sealed with a thoroughness that people described as nearly obsessive. She was not obsessive. She was precise. There is a difference that matters to people who have learned it the hard way. She died around the turn of the century, past 80 years old, having outlived the iron industry that had killed her husband and the settlement that had cast her out. The Carp River furnace was already obsolete by then, replaced by more efficient processes, and the settlement had changed beyond recognition. New families, new structures, new people who did not remember the winter of 1886. The kiln stood for decades after her death. The forest grew back around it, reclaiming the ground that had been stripped of timber in the 1870s and early 1880s, birch and beech, and eventually pine filling in around the stone dome, until visitors who did not know where to look could walk past it without seeing it. What remained and what remains now is a circle of sandstone in the forest. The dome has partially collapsed. The clay collar she built around the chimney opening is gone. The blocked vents are open again, reclaimed by weather and time. But the walls are there. The stones she sealed and the stones she didn't seal, the sandstone blocks that were fitted by workers she never knew before she was born, the walls that absorbed every fire they had ever held and released that heat slowly and patiently into whatever space they enclosed. They still hold warmth. Put your hand against them on a cold day in the right season, and you can feel it. Not much. A whisper of it. The last trace of something that was stored a very long time ago and has been releasing ever so slowly ever since. There is no marker, no plaque, no sign that explains what happened in that stone dome on the night of January 9th, 1886, or why 63 people walked 2 miles through a blizzard and lived, or what an old Finnish woman knew about rivers and cold, and the memory of fire and stone that no one else in 14 miles had bothered to learn. Only the stones, and the stones remember everything. They remember it the way they have always remembered things, slowly and without urgency, holding what they hold through season after season, patient as the earth itself, indifferent to whether anyone knows they are there. Patient as a woman who knew the truth for 5 months before anyone was ready to hear it. Patient as someone who was right all along and simply waited for the winner to say so.